Putting on headphones.
Great.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Hi. Hello.
Welcome, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Happy to be here.
Wanted to bring you into the studio here today because, well, I guess I should tell people I'm Matt. I'm the producer that worked with you on this show. If people are wondering who I am.
Matt Martin,
Yeah.
producer.
We have a very special episode of Let the Kids Dance today for everyone. Jonathan, after we released episodes, Ben Gibbard, the frontman for Death Cab for Cutie, he reached out to you and said that he really liked the show.
That's right. Yeah, out of the blue, I got an email from Ben Gibbard, which was a real surprise. And he wanted to let us know how much he enjoyed the podcast. He had a couple questions he wanted to ask and really kind of volunteered to participate in some shape or form in any kind of future podcast endeavors around Let the Kids Dance and the TDO, which was super generous on his behalf. And I took him up on it. We had also been offered any kind of signal boost we could get from Easy Street Records, a record shop in West Seattle. Matt Vaughn, the owner there, was a big fan as well and had reached out just to say, hey, anything we can do to help spread the word on the podcast. And so we sort of put two and two together and decided, or we asked Ben if he would like to participate in a live interview on stage at Easy Street. And he said yes. And to round things out, we also invited the most prolific all-ages music promoter in Seattle in the 90s, a woman named LeFavor, and she was available for this live interview, and so we paired her with Ben Gibbard on stage at Easy Street in front of 70 or 80 people, a really awesome and involved audience, and just sort of let them rip.
Yeah, and it was great. It was a great night. I'm really excited to share it with everyone. But before we get to that, we wanted to take this opportunity to kind of give everyone a little bit of backstory on this podcast and talk about how people can support this show, people that loved Let the Kids Dance, and how they can support KUOW, where I work, and other shows like it. And so, Jonathan, I'm wondering, you've been a music journalist in Seattle for a long time. Why did you want to make this story into a podcast?
Well, I think it after months of trying to bang out a magazine story that was going to be sort of a 10,000 word long form multi-part magazine story, it became clear to me that was not the ideal format for this story. We have so many of the characters who were, the major motivators and movers in the Teen Dance Ordinance story are alive and willing to talk, and seemed like a big, bright, flashing sign that this was meant to be a podcast and not an article.
I remember when I got the email from you that you were like, hey, do you want to do this podcast? And you had already done all of these interviews. And I was just like, this is amazing. I had never heard of the Teen Dance Ordinance before. And I was like, this is crazy history. And you already had all this research done. And I was like, this seems like a no-brainer. I was really excited.
Yeah. And frankly, your enthusiasm went a really long way. It was clear right off the bat that you and Jim were both pretty, gung-ho about...
Jim, who's our editor.
Oh, Jim Gates, our editor, of course. Shout out to Jim Gates. We're really enthusiastic about doing it. And that enthusiasm certainly, it was clear that you guys were the right choice. And, you and I had worked together before with Patricia Murphy's radio show. I had been on Bill Radke's Friday afternoon show talking about local music a couple times over the years when I was at City Arts Magazine. So I had a little bit of prior experience working with you guys.
Yeah, there's a relationship there. Yeah, and it's been so great. I definitely feel like it was a labor of love on both ends. And I feel like we had the audio expertise and you had the kind of cultural knowledge and great writing chops to kind of tell this story. So I want to back up to that email from Ben Gibbard because he called out this moment that's one of his favorite from the series, and I think it's a favorite of both of us as well.
Yeah, right. There is a moment in episode 7 where we go to Bumbershoot in 2001 or 2000 rather, and he and Death Cab for Cutie are on stage. the mayor had just vetoed the all-ages dance ordinance, and the band was irate, as was most of the music community at that time, that the mayor had kind of, as a turncoat or just turned on them and vetoed this legislation to replace the teen dance ordinance that everybody thought was going to, get rubber stamped and passed. And that didn't happen. And so he and Chris Walla, and Chris is the person who explains it in the podcast, led the crowd in this, very sort of poignant message that was just a hilarious. And Ben said that he was out on a run and he had to stop because he was laughing so hard when this audio came up, and he had no idea that there was any recording of that moment from 23 years ago, and it was just a really sort of this magical moment for him.
Yeah, and that was, I just got to say, that was like one of my proudest producer moments, was being able to find that audio, because I remember we were interviewing Chris Walla and he told us that story, and I was like, there has to be audio of this, and I searched all over the internet and couldn't find anything, and then eventually, through Chris's help, went through this like network of people. One of them was like a 40-year-old doctor, but there was all these people that like in the early 2000s were Death Cab super fans and would go to every concert and record them. And so I tapped into this network, and then eventually was able to find this guy that had like a box of analog recordings of Death Cab concerts, and he like rummaged through them and found it. And like, that's how we got the audio for that event. And so I was very proud and very happy that Ben enjoyed listening to that.
Totally. And it really is one of the highlights of the whole series, frankly. I mean, every time we come to that part of the story and you hear that audio, it just gives me goosebumps.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
There's one piece of feedback that I've gotten from this podcast that really has stuck with me. And someone wrote in and said that like this Let the Kids Dance was it was a well-conceived and well-executed show. And they said, as someone who didn't grow up here, I feel like I've been let in on a piece of local lore that makes me feel more connected to this place. And, that made me feel good.
I love
this.
that.
Yeah. And, I just want to say to people out there that if you feel that way about this show, and if you feel like this connected you to Seattle, or that you learned something more about this place, to please go to KUOW.org/dance and make a donation. We'll, now throw it to you on stage, Jonathan.
All right. Okay, so just by way of brief introduction, Lori LeFavor has put on an estimated 3,000 concerts around the Pacific Northwest. 3,000 shows, most of them all ages. And this goes back to 1987, when Lori was still in high school putting on her very first show. And if you can imagine a band from the 90s, chances are Lori put them on a stage. And Lori probably put them on the stage at Rock Candy, the all-ages venue that she owned and operated for many years during the middle of the 90s. Lori's told me that she doesn't have children of her own, but she does have thousands of Rock Candy kids. All these young people that came out to shows over the years and had the best nights of their lives at the concerts that she was putting on. And I'm really pleased to have her here tonight. So give it up for Lori LeFavor.
Thanks for having me.
Our second guest needs no introduction, but we'll give him one anyway. You may know Ben Gibbard from such bands as Death Cab for Cutie and the Postal Service. Maybe you've bought one of the millions of albums that he's sold over the years. Maybe you saw him play live with both bands at Climate Pledge just a few months ago as part of an ongoing world tour with both bands. Ben is a beloved local singer, songwriter, and band leader, and an ardent supporter of all ages music, going all the way back to when he was a teenager in Bremerton, going to all ages shows. We are very fortunate to have him in the house tonight, so give it up for Ben Gibbard.
Thanks for having me.
So both of you guys contributed to the podcast indirectly, right? You weren't technically on the podcast, but Lori, you and I spoke almost 2 years ago when I was first starting research for the podcast, and you told me all about being a teenager growing up in Mount Baker and going to all ages shows at some really dodgy venues in Pioneer Square. And this is before the TDO. This is before grunge. This is the early 80s. And it sounds like a wild time back then. So I'm hoping maybe you can start us off by just sort of taking us back to that time.
It was pretty unique back then for sure, but I started going to shows when I was 12, so I was really young even then. My first show ever, like big concert, was the Judas Priest Scream for Vengeance tour. And then I went to Iron Maiden Killers and Fastway and Saxon and sprained my neck. But it was in my blood, and my parents were incredibly supportive after I proved myself by calling them every half hour when I went to a show. And so I was allowed to go to shows really young. And it started at Lake Hills Concert Hall for me, which is on the east side, and it was a roller rink, and they started doing metal shows. And I can't remember if it was Screaming Vengeance tour or Killers tour, I met a bunch of people who were from the east side and had been going to shows there. A lot of them later were in huge bands. But they kind of were my pathway. So even though I lived in Mount Baker, I was going all the way to Crossroads to go to shows. And this band called Overlord was sort of like my foundation band. And through them, I met tons of people, and everyone's path to music is different, but mine was metal for sure. Then through metal, I found glam and punk rock and everything else. But I wasn't doing the shows, but I was helping kind of do the shows. And then through Overlord, Green River and My Eye and Catbutt had asked me to do the first all-ages show in Seattle, and I had discovered Washington Hall. And in 1987, I did their show, and that was my first show ever.
Green River, My Eye, and
Catbutt.
Catbutt. Love Catbutt.
Yes.
Ben, do you recall your first concert experience?
Yeah, I mean, I had first concert experiences in Bremerton, which were a bunch of our friends renting out a Grange Hall and putting on a show. The first show I ever played, we opened for the Gits. My little high school band opened for the Gits in Bremerton. It was pretty. It's a pretty great calling card. But no, I believe my first show that I saw in Seattle was the '92 Sub Pop Ultra Lame Fest with Mudhoney and Super Suckers and Seaweed and Pond and Earth and a bunch of bands. So I think that was the first show I saw in Seattle as a kid. But soon after, I started spending a lot of time at the OK Hotel and Rock Candy and DV8 and some other places around town that were able to do all-ages shows at the time.
So tell me about your experience at the OK Hotel. It sounds like that was the core venue for you coming over from Bremerton on the ferry. Maybe you could walk us through an evening of teenage Ben Gibbard going out to the OK Hotel.
Yeah. So the OK Hotel it's still in the same location. It's just right across the water from the ferry terminal. It's no longer a venue, but so we would take an 8 a.m. ferry over from Bremerton with $5 in our pocket. And whatever the show cost, and we would just walk around Seattle looking at all the records we could not afford to buy. And we would go to the Godfather's Pizza on Broadway and get an all-you-can-eat lunch, one all-you-can-eat lunch, and then sneak pizza out to our friends like complete assholes. And then we would get to the show early enough that if you got the OK Hotel had this policy that if you were eating in the restaurant, you could skip the line for the show. So we were just right at the line of what was an acceptable amount of money to be spending to technically be eating in the restaurant. So it would be 4 cups of coffee and a plate of French fries or something like that.
Everybody just got the hummus.
Or they got the hummus, yes. And then they'd come around like, do you guys want anything else? And we're like, no, we're good. We're good. And then we'd see the show, and because I had a curfew, I had to be on the 10:30 ferry heading back to Bremerton.
So you missed the headliner a lot.
I missed the headliner every time. Or I would be watching one of my favorite bands, maybe a band like Tree People, whose shirt I'm wearing right now, and they'd be going into my favorite song, and I'd be looking out the door going, that ferry leaves in 2 minutes, and I need to run across the street to just basically jump on the boat as it's leaving. And most of my evenings ended like that. Yeah.
Well, tell us about the OK Hotel. What was the vibe like? How did it sound? What did it smell like?
You want to take that one?
It's very different, I think, probably from depending on where you were in the room. And my first experience at the OK Hotel, the person they hired as the manager was like an ex-motorcycle gang guy. So that's the person I was dealing with. Yeah, Chuck. Yeah. And his favorite security guard was Orrin, who's now passed away, but is an infamous Seattle punk rock dude that was ginormous and scary and not I don't know how to say it, Oren's dead, but he was. I kicked him out of just as many shows as he let me into. I'll just put it that way. But it was a very visceral experience, to say the least. I sold out a lot of shows there, and I didn't go there before I started doing shows there, but the floor moved.
Yes.
And so that was the thing, is that a lot of venues in Seattle have the cafe and then the venue, but your capacity is the whole building, and when the show is happening, everyone's in that room. So it's not technically how it's supposed to work, but it was very, very overcrowded a lot of times.
Well,
and you would feel like you're going to fall through the floor.
And I remember it just felt, as Lori was saying, the venue was in the back of the cafe, and it just felt like you'd go through this doorway into like a forbidden experience. There were no windows. It felt like it probably might have, I'm sure there was a door that went to the alley, but it felt like a fire hazard.
Yeah.
But as a kid coming from Bremerton, where we were somewhat sheltered, it just felt like a very exciting experience to be.
There was phenomenal shows there. I mean,
There
there
were
really
phenomenal
was.
shows. And I think as a kid growing up, I grew up in the 80s, and until I discovered my own music, I really thought that in order to be in a band, you had to play like ripping guitar solos, and you had to have long hair, and you had to look cool, and it had to be a whole thing, and that shows only happened in arenas, because that's what you'd see on MTV. The shows didn't happen in small places. And then as a kid, there's this light that flicked on for me when I saw bands that I admired loading their own equipment on stage, setting it up, then tearing it down, going to sell merch. You could talk to them. They were approachable. And it may sound kind of trite now, but at the time, as a 15-year-old kid, that was a really eye-opening experience that, oh no, I can do this too. If I see that guy doing it or that woman doing it, I can do it too. I don't have to have special clothes, or I don't have to be able to play really well. I just have to be earnest and believe in what I'm doing, and maybe somebody will care about it someday.
Can you think of any highlight shows that you saw there? I mean, the OK Hotel is maybe most famous as the venue where Nirvana played Smells Like Teen Spirit for the first time in 1991. Were either of you guys at that show?
I wasn't. No. The OK Hotel did so many other shows than just grunge shows in reality. I mean, that was almost the minority. I mean, I did the walkabouts there a lot, and I did the ganja farmers there a lot, and and Sky Cries Mary played there a lot. I did my first No Effects show there. I did No Effects there. I mean, No Means No there like 30,000 times. I don't know. They'd play coming down and coming up. So we'd usually do either 2 all ages shows or 1 all ages show and 1 bar show on which direction they were going from Canada. But they played there so many times. They probably played there twice a year at least, if not more, for 10 years. Well, I don't know. I guess it wasn't 10 years. It wasn't open that long. But at least 3 years, I guess. Coffin Break played there a lot. Green Day played their first Seattle show there. I think it was their first Seattle show.
Yeah, when you mentioned Coffin Break, Rob Skinner went to our high school, went to Olympic High School. So Coffin Break to me and my friends was like the Velvet Underground, because we saw Rob as this person who got out of Bremerton. Like, he got out of Bremerton, he was playing music in Seattle. You could do it. You could get out of this place. All due respect to Bremerton, my parents lived there. But
did you go to Natasha's very often?
But it was a place I wanted to leave at the time. So, and I remember going to see. I saw Coffin Break a bunch of times there. But I remember Rob had a new band called Popsicle for a while. It was kind of more of like a pop punk kind of thing. Yeah, and they were closing the show at the OK Hotel. This is maybe early '94, and the band that was setting up to play second was taking forever to set up. And mind you, as I was just saying, I had to be on the 10:30 ferry to go home, and I'm like, I'm going to miss this Coffin Breaks, and I'm going to miss Popsicle's entire set, because these guys are taking forever to set up. And eventually it became apparent, the singer's amp is broken, they found another amp, and they start playing, and they start with this song In Circles, and it was Sunny Day Real Estate, and it changed my fucking life. And it was just like, I had no idea what was about to happen to me. And that was one of the beautiful things about that venue and about all ages music in Seattle, is you could stumble into something and find something that was going to change your life, and you didn't even know it was going to happen, especially at that time before the internet and before blogs and all this kind of stuff. The sense of discovery, of really discovering something in the live setting and really being blown away by the power of it, was something that was such a formative part of my life. And I'll never forget seeing Sunny Day Real Estate. This was before Diary was out, and they were signed to Sub Pop. They were putting out the record, but I had not heard them. And just they started with that music, and I just was like, I know what I want to do now. And those are these moments that only happen, or they happen more often at all ages venues than they do at bars. Because when you're a kid and you're going to a show and you're forming your identity, you're finding the things that you love and that make you who you are, music is a huge part of that. And the earnesty and the emotion that kids have in those settings is just really powerful and really palpable. And it was, that show in particular made such a huge impact on my life.
Ben, when you first got in touch with me, you were wondering how the OK Hotel managed to put on all ages shows under the thumb of the Teen Dance Ordinance. And I got in touch with Steve Freeborn. Shout out to Steve Freeborn, who I believe is here tonight. There we go. And he gave me some intel on how they made that happen, and it's hilarious and fascinating. And it sounds like it was a combination of things. First of all, it was befriending the fire department and the cops in Pioneer Square, and doing that specifically by cleaning out all the heavy objects on the floors above the venue space in the OK Hotel, which was a hotel and was full of metal bed frames and other like boilers and things like that, which are hazards for firemen running into a burning building. If that falls through the burning floor and crushes a fireman, they're dead. So they were very pleased that they removed all of this hazardous material. But then there was also, I guess, an ally at the city when Steve was looking to permit the place, who kind of took a couple days to shuffle through all the different varieties of permits and came back with an art gallery permit with a special restaurant license. And that way, when there was live music at the OK Hotel, it wasn't a concert and it wasn't a dance, it was an artistic performance. And all ages could come and enjoy the music, which is just brilliant. It's so great. But eventually, it sounds like sort of financial necessity forced Steve and the owners of the OK Hotel to build a bar to increase revenue, which was then pretty much the end of all ages shows at the OK Hotel. And that was around the time, or maybe a couple years after that, Lori, when you sort of migrated to Rock Candy and picked up all ages shows at Rock Candy. So could you talk about maybe making that transition and like...
Well, it wasn't quite that smooth. I mean, basically, I started in '87 with Washington Hall and finding there's a thing called Apple Hall Finders. It was in the phone, and I would go through it, and I would call every hall once a week. And basically just try and find any space I could. And so it started with Washington Hall, and then sometimes we would find somewhere that we could use a couple times. Sometimes it turned into a thing. But Washington Hall was probably the longest, and then after that it was SUP, the Sailors Union of the Pacific. And that was in '92 that we started that. And that was, no one had used it besides maybe like a dance here and there.
Right,
and
that's the space that is the new Crocodile.
it's the new Crocodile. And we had really amazing, Elastica played there, Bikini Kill played there, Korn played there, Radiohead played there, the Presidents of the United States, Seaweed, Superchunk, trying to remember. But we did a silkscreen poster for every show, and I hand printed the tickets because I was boycotting Ticketmaster. And after that, Ticketmaster let me write my own contract. And I was supposedly the first person who was able to do that because they were so sad they didn't get the money from Radiohead. But anyways, after that, it was pretty much after that I found Rock Candy. So at first it was booking it, and then it sort of became, you're the only reason that this is happening. The owners were just like, basically, if you will catch up on the utilities, you can have the business. So I did. So I paid for the utilities, and then I owned Rock Candy until it closed. But
And you were hosting legal all ages shows. You were jumping through all the hoops of the TDO in order to put on...
oh, and I forgot
legal all ages
Lake
shows.
City Concert Theater. I did 2 shows there. I did Social Distortion and Fugazi there. It was a really unique time and space, and amazing bands came through that are just phenomenally huge now. The police actually harassed me the most at SUP. So I think that by the time I got to Rock Candy, and they harassed me at Lake City, I mean, they've been harassing me for a really long time. They were so used to me that it was a little bit more of an entity. And I was trying to tell you on the phone, I think I did know Jim Pugel. I think we had talked by that point. He was my neighbor, but he didn't realize that I was doing shows. He was the police captain, later lieutenant.
Lieutenant.
Yeah. And so I think by Rock Candy it was a little bit better and easier. And I mean, they were pretty intimidated at that point because they were dealing with me and 800 kids behind me at every show. So it wasn't quite the same thing as the Washington Hall or somewhere else. It was there was a line around the block almost every show. And I had a really scary experience with the fire marshal where I had the most sold out GWAR show I'd ever had. And he showed up, and I was like, it's over. The walls are sweating. I'm so effed. And he's like, I'm not even want to talk about it. You just need to let my fucking kids in. I'm like, okay.
For GWAR. Love it. So Ben, it sounds like you saw some shows at Rock Candy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the way it would work is we would get the Rocket every week, and you would open up the listings, and as a teenager in the 90s, oftentimes you're like, oh my God, so-and-so's coming. Fuck, they're at Crocodile. Ah, they're at Off-Ramp. But then you'd see the listing for Rock Candy and be like, oh my God, so-and-so's playing at Rock Candy. That's awesome. We can go see that. Or so-and-so's playing at the OK. Or so-and-so's playing at, maybe a theater or something like that. So it was this kind of game of constantly being disappointed about what shows you weren't allowed to see because you were a minor. And as a kid, me and my friends we weren't X's on our hands, straight edge, but we didn't drink, we didn't do drugs, and we just didn't understand why we couldn't go and see these shows. We had zero interest in drinking. We had zero interest.
Did you go to Natasha's at all, or were you too young at that point?
Too young. Yeah, because that closed around the time I was able to drive anywhere. So, but Rock Candy was also one of these places.
Natasha's was a big hall in the middle of a parking lot in Bremerton that we did a bunch of punk rock shows.
Yeah, and it had a reputation for being a little seedy, even by Bremerton standards. But no, I mean, it was you'd kind of skip past. You'd be disappointed at the listing at the Crocodile, all the shows you couldn't see, or the Off-Ramp, but then you'd immediately go to the Rock Candy and see this long list of shows, and it was so heartening to know that as a kid you could go to any of these shows, so long as, at least for me, they weren't on a school night, because I wasn't allowed to go to Seattle on a school night. But on the weekends, we saw so many shows there, so many shows, as we said, at the OK, and as I said in our email correspondence, like, all ages music was absolutely on the ropes at that point in Seattle, but it wasn't necessarily beaten, and it wasn't beaten because of people like Lori, who were putting so much time and effort and money into making sure that we had a place to go to see shows, and Steve as well. And I think that as we tell the story of the teen dance ordinance in this time in Seattle, we really need to focus on the adults, whether or not you saw yourself as an adult at that time or not, the adults that were willing to risk financial ruin to make sure that we had a place to go. And they deserve all the credit in the world for doing that.
I wasn't an adult, and I was playing with my rent money. So
My conversation with Ben and Lori will continue after the break. We started the night with performances from Kim West and Ryan Devlin, whose names you might recognize from the end credits of every Let the Kids Dance episode as the composers and performers of the Let the Kids Dance soundtrack. They're immensely talented and endlessly kind, and with just a keyboard and an acoustic guitar and their own voices, they played songs by their band Smoky Brights, and really just riled up the crowd and got everybody excited about the power of all ages music.
Hello! We're here to celebrate the fact that kids can see music in Seattle. And this song is about how music saves. It's called Save Us, Sarah. Sarah's been here for a while. She's the city's abandoned child. Black denim studded star. Faded tattoos on her arms. She says old punks never die. Still got the band, still doing alright.
says I don't have to be polite. To some kid who moved here last night. Save us, Sarah. Nobody plays like you. Turn it up loud and break some hearts now. Do what you came to do. Oh, 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 oh. Sharing stories, sharing cigarettes. Oh, 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 oh. In the neon glow after Sarah's set. Oh, 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 oh. While our city disappeared. Oh, 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 oh. Still got that ringing in our ears. She says old punks never die. Laughing smoke into the night. They knock this place down yet. Still got time for new regrets. Save us, Sarah. Nobody plays like you. Turn it up loud and break some hearts now. Do what you came to do. Save us, Sarah. Nobody plays like you. Kick my beer over on the bar top, playing guitar in your torn up shoes.
Acoustic guitar solo.
Save us, Sarah. Save us, Sarah. Save us, Sarah. Do what you came to do. Save us, Sarah. Nobody plays like you. Turn it up loud and break some hearts now. Do what you came to do. Save us, Sarah. Nobody plays like you. Kick my beer over on the bar top, playing guitar in your torn up shoes. Save us, Sarah. Nobody plays like you. Save us, Sarah. Do what you came to do. Save us, Sarah. Do what you came to do.
Long live all ages music. Long
Hell
live
yeah.
Seattle music. Music saves. Don't keep it away from people, especially kids.
So, Ben, you started Death Cab in Bellingham, where there was no teen dance ordinance.
No, there was not.
Yeah, so was that like night and day? I mean, what was the all-ages scene like in Bellingham?
Yeah, there was a house called the Humdinger House that did shows in the basement. There was the 3B if you want to play a bar. Yeah, but it was a lot of, just find a room, rent it for a couple $100, bring a PA in, and do a show. I mean,
Like it should be.
It was the kind of stuff we did in high school. We found a Grange Hall in Silverdale that we could rent for $100. And eventually it got so destroyed that it became cost prohibitive. It was this thing where it was $100, then the mirrors got ripped off the bathroom walls, then it was $200, then it was $300, till it was like $1,000, and then we had we can't afford to do shows anymore.
Or they just don't let you do it anymore.
Or they
That's what
wouldn't-
had
well,
happened here.
and
You'd
look-
use it till they wouldn't let you anymore.
Yeah, and at the time we're like, why won't they let us do shows? But now I'm like, yeah, it makes sense. Like, we were totally destroying the place. But no, it was a lot of just basements and living rooms and places like that. The college at Western Washington University was putting on shows. They would do small coffee house shows. So it was not difficult to play all ages in Bellingham, as it was basically anywhere outside the city limits of Seattle. You just had to...
Tacoma actually had a better scene for a while than Seattle did.
Yeah, I remember going to see a lot of shows at Java Jump. That place.
Back then it was Legends,
Okay.
and then it was also the Community World Theater. So it was basically kind of before Seattle was organized. There was organized shows happening in Tacoma for a while, and I did a few shows in Tacoma. That was kind of easier at that time than doing in Seattle. So it would kind of shift. And then Olympia had some shows, and I started doing shows in Olympia in 1990.
I remember seeing a lot of shows at KGRG, and I remember seeing Seaweed there a number of times. They seemed to play every
Where
weekend.
was that?
The radio station wasn't it Auburn?
It was at Green River Community College. So they had KGRG, which is still a radio station. When we were teenagers, we couldn't get what is now KXP, what was KCMU, but we could get KGRG at one of our friends' houses who happened to live in a valley. And so we would tape hours, we would just hit record and tape hours of KGRG and then make mixtapes of that. And that's one of the ways we found out a lot of
KGRG
things.
actually sponsored most of the shows at Rock Candy.
I would believe that, yeah. So they would put on shows, and bands that they were playing would play at Green River Community College. So we would drive around to see those shows. But yeah, I mean, it was really just the city limits of Seattle. There were only a couple places, obviously, as we've been saying, OK Hotel, Rock Candy. But once you got outside the city limits of Seattle, there were all these shows everywhere, and that was what's so frustrating about it.
Yeah, that's just wild. So that brings us up to 2000. Death Cab for Cutie, playing Bumbershoot, and this sort of quintessential moment in the podcast. And I'll give you a little bit of historical context. So earlier in the year, Bumbershoot is like August, September. Earlier that year, the Music and Youth Task Force, which you were a part of, Lori, a group of music industry professionals and musicians and advocates that met with city officials, they hammered together legislation to replace the teen dance ordinance. And it was called the All Ages Dance Ordinance. And it was actually written by Greg Bennick, who's in the back here. Shout out Greg Bennick, who used an early search engine, Lycos or Ask Jeeves, to find other music ordinances and dance ordinances from other cities around the U.S., and he cobbled those together, and wherever it said no all ages music and no dancing, he changed it to yes all ages music and yes dancing, and basically put together this piece of legislation that supported all ages music, and submitted that to the task force, and the task force submitted it to the city council, and the city council approved it, and it looked like, boy, this is going to change everything about all ages music in Seattle. All we need now is for Paul Schell, the mayor, to pass the legislation, and it'll change the law. And everybody figured it was a rubber stamp. There was a ton of support behind the AADO. And yet, for reasons we will never know, Paul Schell vetoed the AADO. And yeah, really. It immediately became the enemy of the music community, which leads us to Death Cab on stage at Bumbershoot in 2001. Ben, could you maybe take it from there?
My Chris Swallow, who's in Death Cab, tells the story probably better than I could on the podcast. But we had decided to pull this little stunt where we would call the mayor's office and leave a terse message about how much we disapproved of his veto of the All Ages Dance Ordinance. And as Chris says in the podcast, it's 2000. We had one cell phone amongst the four of us, and it was his phone. So he calls the mayor, and he leaves this very eloquent, kind of terse voicemail on what we assume is the mayor's, not his home voicemail, mind you, his office voicemail. And then we had decided beforehand to lead the crowd in a chant of "Fuck you, Paul Shell," and that was very satisfying. But what I didn't know at the time was that my girlfriend at the time was a first grade teacher, and she had invited all of her students through their parents to this show. And that wasn't the kind of tone that she was expecting. And she was very upset with me on the drive home. But I feel it was worth it. And it was when I heard the podcast, I didn't know that audio even existed. So I was listening to it just as a fan of the podcast. And all of a sudden, you kind of go into the narrative of this moment at Bumbershoot. I was like, oh, I wonder if they've got audio of it. So it was really heartening to hear that audio again all these years later. I got in trouble, but it was worth it.
We actually have the audio queued up. Wyatt, could you maybe play that back for us?
So we get the mayor on the phone. Okay, you're gonna talk for a second, then I'll go 1, 2, 3, and we'll say, "Fuck you, Paul Shell." And the crowd, I think, has a message for you. 1, 2, 3. Fuck you, Paul Shell! Thank you,
Truly a highlight of the entire podcast series. Such an awesome moment. So that was 2000. 2 years later, new mayor, a bunch of new city council members, and finally, the teen dance ordinance is overturned and the AADO is installed, which we still have to this day. A monumental moment. Do you guys remember where you were, or was it even a monumental moment when you heard about that?
It wasn't a monumental moment in that I remember where I was. But I do remember that we, as a band, were discussing it after it was passed, and it just felt we were just so relieved that young people in this city were not going to be subjected to the same kind of bullshit that we were subjected to, and there seemed to be this just explosion of all ages music in the wake of that. And shows that were there would be a bar, if I'm recalling correctly, there would be a bar cordoned off. You had to show ID or get your hand stamped over to go in there. The way it is in every other city in America, and it was disappointing that it took so long for us to get there, to kind of normalize what other cities have been doing for decades. But we were just glad that it had finally happened. And as I said, that kids living in the city would be able to have similar experiences that we had, going to the limited number of all ages venues we could go to, but that there would be virtually no barriers to them seeing whatever they wanted to see. They didn't have to look through the listings and determine which shows they were allowed to go to or not. And as I said earlier, it was really disappointing when one of my favorite bands would come through. And there were bands that I never saw because when they came through Seattle, they didn't play all ages, and it wasn't their fault. I'm not putting it on them for not doing it. They were just so limited. There were so few venues, so few opportunities on the dates they wanted to come through. I'm sure you probably were batting bands back left and right who wanted to play all ages, and sorry, we got 5 holds on this date.
Not really until Rock Candy in Graceland, because it actually took, I'd say, until the mid-'90s for bands to even consider Oregon and Washington as regular tour stops all the time. Most bands stopped in California, and that's one of the reasons that I started, because I was like, I'm going to get them to come all the way up here. And so there was someone in Portland that we would talk, and he would do those shows, and I would do the other shows, and we were just trying to get bands to come all the way up. And so it was pretty new to even have that opportunity that everyone, it started by the 90s for sure. But I think you're going to say this too, but what happened once the teen dance ordinance was repealed, then it was really clear that, sure, it's technically easier to do all ages shows, but yes, you need to have a bar, and you need to make the money off the bar, and then you have to divide it. And there was very strict rules about exactly how it was divided, and then it was also the bars would charge more money to do all ages shows because they weren't going to make as much off the bar. It wasn't just the TDO, it was the liquor laws and then trying to combine it and address everything. So then it kind of became clear that you have a whole new set of issues. And then people that ran the venues They didn't really want to do all ages shows all the time because they didn't make money. And then adults started complaining that I don't want to go to an all ages to see my favorite band, and I don't want to go to that show if it's all ages. And so we started dealing with a lot of that stuff. And then bands not actually having a good enough all ages draw to do the show all ages, and then the charges you were going to get if you did the show all ages. So you actually had to decide a lot of the time. And then the kids would be pissed, but if there was only 30 kids that would have come to an all ages show, that's going to cost you $2,000 more to do it all ages, then you started to have to make that choice. And that started happening a lot.
It's never been easy, and probably never will be. Well, let me ask you the question that kind of underlies this whole conversation. And Ben, you touched on this a little bit. Why is all ages music important?
Well, I think for so many people, you, me, I mean, it's when you're a kid, it's such an incredibly important part of your life. It's a lot of times it's how you form your identity. It's how you meet your friends. I mean, the thing about Rock Candy, like I said, it was so unique. So many people came to every show and they met their best friends. They met their partners. And it influenced who they are. I mean, that's what they've all said is like finding my tribe and the bands that I love and my identity. It's like that's the time that really happens. And I think that it's even more, I don't know, tactile, visceral, whatever you want to use when you're a kid. And I think that from age, at least for me, it was 12, but a lot of kids, it's like 14, 13. And I even felt so bad for the kids that were that age at COVID and they missed out. And they missed out on going to shows for 2 years. And I think it really had a huge effect on a lot of people. And I think that if you don't have access to that, and I think the shows are usually, I mean, kids are just a lot of times more frenetic and crazy. And I think for a band, even a lot of times playing all ages shows is more fun. Well, I guess it's a bunch of drunk people probably fun sometimes too. But again, people in Seattle are so stoic. A lot of times when they watch shows, kids are not stoic usually. They're so good that they'll sit down at a dashboard confessional show and like 6,000 of them and sit on the floor. But it's amazing the difference I think between all. I mean, I'm not a performer, but for me experiencing it and watching kids. I mean, watching the shows at Rock Candy and just watching the kids. I showed you some pictures. It was amazing. It was always and even at Graceland. And then even the difference between now we have to have barricades. I hate barricades because I feel like that creates, I don't know, a weird distance. And there's something about that intimacy that when they're right there. And I don't know how you have to have barricades these days, but I hate them.
I mean, I don't know how much I don't know if I could say it much better than how Lori just said it, but I would add that I think when we are young, we're so enthusiastic and we're not jaded yet. And being in a room with people playing instruments into a PA, the volume and just the feeling of being amongst other, in this case, young people, having this experience with music is something that is so unique to being young. And we've all gone to shows as adults, at least those of us who are adults, and you go and you see your friends and you maybe have a beer and you cross your arms. You're like, oh, I'll go see this band. I heard they're kind of okay, but I've seen so many bands in my life. Maybe they'll be fine. And you leave and you're like, how was it? It was okay. I like a couple songs. But when you're a kid, all those shows that I saw, even the ones that I look back and maybe objectively were kind of bad, they still filled me with such a sense of wonder and excitement that, I was watching people who didn't look that much different than me on stage expressing themselves. And as I kind of touched on earlier, it gave me the confidence to feel like I could do it too. And I think the earlier that is instilled in young people that anything they want to do is possible, the better. And that's an experience that I had innumerable times at Rock Candy and at OK Hotel and other all-ages shows that I saw. And I think that really is the core of it. It's empowering and inspiring young people to make art and to realize that you don't have to jump through all these hoops to do it. You don't have to look a certain way. You don't have to play a certain way. You can just get up and you can just do it. And all ages music gives people, and specifically young people, that push out of the nest to make them feel like they can do it. And I think that at the core is the most important part of it.
So because we're here at Easy Street, one of the great music stores of the world, I want to ask you guys, back in the 80s and the 90s, where did you go shopping for music?
Tower Records.
And what did you buy?
Metal. Accept, trust. We'd special order. We'd sit there fiendishly going through what they had, and then we'd special order and we wait. We'd go once a week, and you had to hunt down music.
Where was the Tower Records in Seattle?
The bottom of Queen Anne.
we would go to Fallout Records on Capitol Hill because
Eventually
we knew,
Fallout, yeah.
because we knew that Tom Price from Gashuffer worked there, so we would go there and just creep out on him and act like we didn't. That
Back
he
then
didn't.
it was Tom Price from the U-Men.
Yeah, well, yeah, we would be like we're gonna act like we don't know who he is, but he knows that we know who he is, and we would linger way too long. We would go to Orpheum on 10th or end of Broadway, and usually it would be we'd come over shows and I would have enough money to buy like a 7-inch or something like that. So I would be leaving with, the
Fallout was really amazing though because it was really the first punk. Like they had so much punk rock, skate,
Yeah.
and it was actually a community. Well, the place on 2nd Ave, I'm forgetting what it's called, but they were a phenomenal record store too.
Well, and as kids growing up in Bremerton, it was the mall. It was Sam Goody. It was Sam Goody. That's what it was. So going to record stores in Seattle, we were all blown away that all the records we'd seen in the back of the Rocket, like you could pick them up and hold them, or you could buy them if you had any money. And it was just this treasure trove of albums and music that we'd all either heard of or wanted to buy or were listening to thanks to KGRG that you could actually access. Because I'm 48 and I'm finding myself prefacing things I say with the statement I'm about to say, but I'll find myself saying things like, now this was the 90s, you got to understand.
Well, and I say this was the 80s, you got to understand.
I say I give the decade and then now you got to understand. So this was the 90s, you got to understand that you just couldn't dial up anything you wanted to listen to. You had to go and get it.
It actually got way easier in the 90s.
You had to go, right, you had to go and get it. So this when we would come over to Seattle, this was like a fishing expedition to find the kind of records that we were only hearing about or reading about. And a lot of times you'd read about a record and you didn't know what it sounded like other than what the writer had told you it sounded like.
Tape trading was a really big deal.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, that's how I met Steven, who was my first assistant. He was an amazing tape trader.
Shout out Steven Severin.
And his best friend John White, who's with him, and they had such good taste in music. And I always was like, I can't teach you that. I can teach you everything else. So I hired him based on his taste in music.
Okay, one last question from me, and it's a bit of a curveball. But let's say that the film rights to Let the Kids Dance have been optioned, and the story of the Teen Dance Ordinance is becoming a major motion picture. Who plays you in the movie?
I was hoping that you were going to ask who's star in this movie, because I would say you'd have to figure out a way to put Kevin Bacon in this movie, right? You'd have to make the Footloose kind of crossover. You'd have to have that element kind of in there. So maybe I don't know who'd play me per se, but I think I think that Kevin Bacon would have to play like Paul Shell or something like that. He'd have to go from the guy who's trying to dance, who's not letting anybody dance.
Ooh,
Or he would be a great council member. There were some pretty pivotal council members too. So,
you guys, this has been great. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Let's give it up for all of our guests tonight: Ben Gibbard, Lori LeFavor, Ryan Devlin, and Kim West. Big thanks to Easy Street. Big thanks to KUOW. And thanks to all you guys. Thanks for being here. Have a great night.
thanks for having us.
And maybe we can get one more song tonight to set the mood for the night.
Hell yeah. Yeah, we've got one more song. Thank you so much to Jonathan. Thank you to Easy Street for having us. Thanks to Wyatt for running sound. And thanks to all of you for showing up for this awesome, my first live podcast taping. I've never been a part of this before. So this song is called All in Who You Know. We actually started recording another record today.
And this is the song we started with, so we were like, what should we play?
Probably this one.
It's a brand new one. It's about looking out for your friends.
Ready?
Yeah.
Closing cashier on Thursday nights is my cousin Kelly and she's alright. We talked about the rising price of stupid shit, of getting by. I picked up a magazine. Brad and Jen look back at me. It's all in who you know. She rang me through and we caught up. Her kids, her folks, the rent and all that stuff. I mean, what are people really supposed to do? Make an MLM, start a cult or two. She rang my card, declined again, but she waved me through, 'cause she's a friend. It's all in who you know. It's all in who you know. I'll buy you beer after your shift. You can't borrow the van, but I'll give you a lift. I mean, what's a job really worth to you? If you see a friend, just wave them through. It's all in who you know. It's all in who you know. All in who you know. So who do you know?
Let's let those kids down! I said, let's let this down! Thank you guys!
Yeah, right on. Give it up one more time for Kim West and Ryan Devlin.